As some of the largest and most derived wyverns, Uragaan and especially Gravios represent the near zenith of wyvern specialization into volcanic areas. Between eating rock, wearing rock, and swimming in rock, there's a lot to talk about. So let's dive into the behaviour and ecology of the stone giants. So as ever, it's best to start by discussing the most prevalent question many may have about such monsters. And for Gravios, it's of course how he can manage to wade in lava and not die. Similar behaviour has been seen, and so similar resistance has evolved independently, in several other families of monster, with piscines and leviathans also capable of at least partial lava submersion, and part of it may depend on the type of lava too. Lava isn't just lava in the same way rock isn't just rock. There are different types of mineral they can be made of, which in turn affects their properties. The type of mineral affects the type of lava, and some are hotter or more viscous than others. The lava most often seen in Monster Hunter volcanoes, be they the Old World volcanic belt or the New World Elder's Recess, is often very viscous, and so likely felsic lava. More viscous lava erupts more explosively, and in the Old World volcanic belt especially, it seems as if the lava is very thick, like honey or tar, both from appearance and explosive eruptions. So this likely means the lava is relatively cool, around 800 degrees or so, and presumably from something similar to rhyolite. It also has the potential to be even cooler. Lava or magma containing water can be cooled by several hundred degrees, and lava with water saturated in it is also more explosive too when erupting. This could also be a factor in allowing life to spring from and persist in lava in the world of Monster Hunter. So it would seem that the swimmable lava on the volcanic belt at least is comparatively cool, thick, felsic or similar lava. For those still awake, the crux is to say that if nothing else, Gravios and other lava swimmers likely swim in the coolest lava, probably around 500 degrees Celsius or so, which is something. It's likely easier to withstand 500 degrees than it is 1200 degrees. But what about actually withstanding very high temperatures? We're pretty well known for keeping our body at around 37 degrees Celsius, or 458,000 or whatever it is in freedom units. And it's worth noting just how well your body does this. When it's a very hot day and you feel like you're boiling, your core temperature is still at that crucial 37. Humans and endothermic vertebrates in general are just really quite good at doing that. But for some, it can actually get a lot higher. For a start, birds in general can tank higher temperatures than we can with ease, with resting core temperatures often in the low 40s. Red-billed quillia can get to almost 50 degrees. And some lizards can get to 51. This might not sound like a lot, but it's pretty impressive. That's halfway to boiling, and when some mammals reach those temperatures, the technical term for their tissues is medium rare. So how does one achieve survival at high temperatures without becoming cooked, and proteins denatured? And the answer is suggested to be chaperone proteins, essentially a group of proteins that either prevent other proteins unraveling or denaturing in heat, or ones that quickly sew them back together when they start to come apart, sometimes specifically called heat shock proteins. And they are effective. Microbial life in hot springs can keep proteins intact and functioning at well over 100 degrees Celsius. So there is some life in our own world that can indeed survive boiling liquids. Such organisms also have other physical adaptations to protect against heat too, it's worth noting. They're not just normal other than chaperone proteins. To apply all of this, one would have to assume that Gravios and other lava-entering monsters have both specialized cells to protect against thermal shock, as well as absurdly potent chaperone proteins. It's unknown how much insulation the shells of such monsters offer too. The lack of such heavy armor in other monsters that can also withstand lava may suggest that Gravios armor is more typical armor, rather than lava-specific armor, although it can function as both. Like some huge armored dinosaurs, it could be top-level protection, and also ablative in nature, absorbing a huge amount of energy before breaking off to better protect the surfaces underneath, and providing good protection against bone-crushing jaws, blunt force trauma, and blasts alike. So whether Gravios and others successfully give their internal workings some protection against the magma to provide a temperature difference in the hundreds of degrees, or whether Gravios is cellularly reinforced to the level of the lava, is unknown. Much of this may have implications for other wyverns and monsters too. Many monsters are huge, and are often described as achieving high internal temperatures, and several live in hot environments like deserts and volcanic regions. This is not a recipe for success, or indeed staying alive. Organisms in fiction span a thermal tolerance spectrum from Gravios to Jagrafes, with the wyvern superfamily and other monsters in general likely having much greater thermal tolerance than animals in our own world. But it's likely not uniform across such families. Whilst essentially all species can probably tolerate internal temperatures higher than we or most vertebrate life can, we still see a lot of adaptations to shed heat, or weaknesses to it, in many species. Many species are still burned and pained by fire, and will readily avoid it. Some are very obviously weak to it. So we can almost speculatively tier monsters into heat tolerance classes. The basic level can still likely tolerate internal temperatures into the 50s or 60s or so, but are still vulnerable to heat stress, and can be burned or have their tissues destroyed by fire. Followed by a medium level of monsters, capable of regularly withstanding notably higher temperatures due to their environment or adaptations, but can still be damaged by significantly greater temperatures and can't withstand prolonged lava contact or submersion. And then finally the top tier of ones capable of submerging in lava with little issue, and are only really weak to develop a favoritism to Brachydios. All of this has interesting broader connotations for the wider world of Monster Hunter 2. One thing is people apparently eat Gravios, which begs the question, how do you cook something even lava can't damage? Eating most wild wyverns raw feels like a poor choice, but presumably Gravios do decay after death, and so microbes can break them down. So one can assume after a dry aging period to start microbial attack, and then being soaked in a water bath to leach out toxic volcanic residues, Gravios meat is intensely pickled for a long time to break it down, before another water bath to make sure no one's jaw dissolves when eating it, and then serving similar to carpaccio or tartare. The notion of a single wingtip feeding a village may be testament to the small portions taken in any one sitting, rather than the amount of meat. Another thing is the parasite guilds that must live on and in such wyverns. Considering the microbial life in our world can withstand far more than higher life forms, then the notion that lava and boiling temperatures can stop a parasite load seems poorly founded. Lava ticks likely abound in the cracks of Gravios' armour, and its tissues and bowels are likely full of fireworms too. Whether these pests would be like Gravios and can tolerate a wide thermal range, or if Gravios' trips to the swamp also serve as cleansing periods due to them not being able to withstand cooler temperatures, is unknown. What happens to a human after eating poorly prepared Gravios is similarly unknown. Whether they'd quickly perish in our tepid 37 degrees, drain their host trying to burn enough energy to warm themselves, or successfully achieve their normal temperatures, and incinerate their host from within remains uncertain. But animals are ecosystems too, and Gravios likely isn't the only one who can handle the lava. And it's worth noting even Gravios are far from completely impervious to lava too. Black Gravios aren't a true subspecies, but simply Gravios that have undergone scorching or some other chemical change from entering lava that's too hot. So when Gravios leave the cooler lava they normally wade in, there are risks, and presumably some lava is too hot for even the lava waders and swimmers of Monster Hunter. For Black Gravios, presumably there are some rewards to prompt them to do this. As said, different lavas sit at different temperatures, and it may be that Black Gravios are the ones that left their cooler felsic lavas for much hotter mafic lavas, presumably to consume the cooling rocks formed by such eruptions and lava flows. The iron and magnesium-rich basalt-like rocks may provide better fare for Gravios willing to risk reaching them, and lead to stronger and healthier individuals that make Black Gravios more powerful wyverns. Be it mafic or felsic, igneous or sedimentary, both Gravios and Uragaan are well known for having a diet of rocks. And whilst humans and many animals will essentially eat certain minerals straight up, It's rare to see something with a diet made entirely of inorganic matter. Rare, but not unheard of. There are a handful of rock-boring invertebrates, and through them and what we know of wyverns like Gravios and Uragaan, we can infer a few things about their evolution and ecology. Perhaps the best-known real-life rock-eater is Lithoredo abbotanica, the stone-boring shipworm, which lives in the limestone riverbanks on Bohol Island in the central Philippines. True to their name, they literally gnaw holes in the stone riverbanks and ingest the limestone as they go. It's currently unknown how or if they fully digest the limestone, but if so, they're likely not doing it alone. Other members of the same family are dependent on symbionts to break down their food, and analysis of the stone borer's gills show they're densely populated by bacterial symbionts in the gills as well. So it seems likely that they're also dependent on gut bacteria for their nutrition. Some other members of the family will also eat the river sediment too, also using bacteria to break it down, and seemingly deriving their nutrients from sulfur. And this isn't hugely unusual. After all, it's not so far removed from many large herbivores, who rely on extensive gut bacteria to break down cellulose and lignin in their digestive tracts as well. Outsourcing your digestion to someone else is pretty common when you digest difficult things, with herbivores benefiting from both sugars resulting from the bacteria breaking down plant matter, but also the fatty acids resulting from dead bacteria too. And so it seems this is what the pair may do as well. The World Book mentions that Uragaan have a stomach full of bacteria to break down the rocks they eat as well, with their sleep gas being a byproduct of this. It's unknown if this is the same in Gravios, but it could be a reasonable assumption. Interestingly, the book also mentions that Uragaan in the New World at least may not just eat any ore, but try to stick to matcholite too. This surprisingly picky diet move for such a large animal may be testament to the richness of the recess, with matcholite seemingly being universally regarded as superior to iron. Another odd behaviour of Uragaan is seemingly beginning digestion of some rocks before eating them, with the tar and sleep gas altering the composition of some minerals in the recess. As well as presumably making them easier to digest, it also sticks these to its body as a portable food source. This may also stem from ore preferences, so Uragaan can take its preferred matcholite to other less productive areas of the recess too. But how did wyverns like Uragaan and Gravios get to such a stage? And it's likely it stemmed from a herbivorous and presumably wood-eating ancestor. Whilst there are considerable differences between stone-boring worms and mayflies, there are not many true rock-eaters to go off otherwise, and every rock-eating animal discovered thus far seems to stem from a wood-eating ancestor, being well equipped to take on a new tough material with strong jaws and symbiont digestion already set in place. And this seems quite possible for Gravios and Uragaan too. The World Book also mentions that juvenile Uragaan consume mainly plant matter, so it seems that the shift from rock to wood may not even be complete if juvenile stages still can't consume rock too early on. Basarios is in a similar boat, and apparently eats animal and plant matter along with ore when young, before switching to a diet of just ore as an adult. Whilst plants generally can't run away, Basarios doesn't have the hallmarks of an especially competent predator. Even with its good camouflage, it's still slow and noisy to emerge. But with some of its neighbours, it may not be a problem. It still shares both volcanoes and swamps with cenotors, and whilst the large shoguns may be too fast and defensive, the youngsters may not be. Basarios needs neither speed nor agility it doesn't have, and it can even dig them out if they try to hide or flee. They may be the ideal food for it no matter where it goes. In general, invertebrates may provide a good fare for Basarios, with many shared traits that would make Hornitors or Bonabra similarly good prey to cenotors, even if less filling. Whilst Basarios may make successful lunges for any other prey too, these likely succeed on luck rather than skill. On this note, Basarios attacks on people are not just them disturbing the Basarios when mining, but are also likely attempted predatory attacks too. Hunter activity may benefit Basarios as well, and they may readily scavenge both meat and minerals from slain monsters, and the kills of other predators, only having to fear the staunchest opponents due to their incredible armour. So some of this does suggest that these very derived wyverns may be closer to their distant relatives than first thought, Gravios is believed to be closest related to the herbivorous monoblos and diablos, and the three may share a distant common ancestor that was a large, flightless, wood-eating wyvern with partial burrowing. Presumably this wyvern or its family was sufficiently widespread to make it to both volcanoes to speciate into Gravios, and the deserts to speciate into the Blos wyverns. Why this initial ancestor species is no longer extant is anyone's guess, although it could be natural changes in the world's climate and vegetation. Duramboros is a similar species convergently emerged in the brute wyverns, with the closely related Bambaro too. Both live in more forested environments, with Duramboros in well-watered deciduous woodlands and rainforest, and Bambaro in taiga forest when not displaced by Shara. So perhaps this distant, flightless, wood-eating ancestor initially lived in warmer, wetter periods of the Earth's history, when primary forests were more widespread, vanishing with them when changes in the Earth's climate dried things out, and turned them more into true grassland and forest grassland mosaics, like the forest and hills or ancestral steppe, where smaller grazing and mixed feeder herbivores like Aptonoth became superabundant instead, and only the specialised pockets of wood-eating ancestors survived in the Blosses and Gravios. For Uragaan, whilst Duramboros may not necessarily be closely related, the same may be true, and Duramboros is a surviving example of that niche in brute wyverns, with them also potentially having more and more widespread wood-eating members. Radobaan in his diet may suggest some atavism in this regard. Whilst bones are still very hard and mineral heavy, possibly more so in the world of Monster Hunter, they're also pretty good food otherwise to those that can access them. Due to the high fat content, fresh bones are a greater source of energy than fresh meat, and dry bones retain their nutritional value very well, with 140 grams of dried bones having as much protein as 111 grams of fresh meat. Different bones also have different values in this regard too, with some species obviously having richer bones than others, and some bones having more protein or fat than others too. In this regard, and possibly like others in the Vale who don't feed on effluvium, Radobaan may be a lot pickier than first thought. They're already described as picky with the bones they select as decoration, and that said bones aren't also picked at random, but they specifically adorn certain bones and fragments to certain parts of their body too. So there's a fair chance they're similarly picky about the bones they eat, and we see this in other bone-eating species too. Bearded vultures will select the fattiest bones on offer that can be swallowed, and select bones over meat or a fleshed carcass. Bone eating is a specific adaptation, and not a compensation for being late to a carcass. Rather, bearded vultures are strategically late to let everyone else sort their wheat from their chaff for them. Their stomach acid is also uniquely strong to break down entire bones, that they don't smash from a height. Radobaan instead just uses his chin and massive reinforced teeth to consume bones in their entirety. For Radobaan, this suggests his diet on a macronutrient level is actually much more similar to a carnivorous brute like Deviljho or Glavenus than to his presumed ancestor Uragaan. But interestingly and weirdly, Radobaan still digests food like Uragaan, using symbiotic bacteria to break down the mineral content of the bones. In this regard, it seems Radobaan may not be quite as specialised as some other osteophage species like the bearded vulture, and may suggest its comparative infancy as a species due to the relative evolutionary infancy of the Rotten Vale as a specialised ecosystem. The pickiness of Radobaan in its bone selection is analogous to a similar behaviour in Uragaan, where the two ornament their bodies with high-quality materials from their surroundings. This is the only time of year it's easy to tell Uragaan apart, as otherwise the two sexes have little sexual dimorphism, and this is presumably similar in Radobaan. In this regard, Uragaan mate selection is likely driven by female choice over male-male competition, with bull Uragaan ornamentation being poorly suited to increase combative ability, and bulls would risk decreasing the luster of such ore by damaging it in fighting, or breaking their carefully picked bones in Radobaan. The jaws of Uragaan and possibly Radobaan also have some importance in this regard too, and a larger and better ornamented jaw is more attractive to a female. The pronounced chin grows as the Uragaan matures, and will look increasingly larger with ornamentation in the breeding season too. so it may be possible to sex Uragaan past a certain age by the size of their chins too. Steel Uragaan and Crystal Beard also come into play here as well. Crystal Beard are rare, but may be incredibly successful males due to the colour and shine of the gemstones they ornament themselves with. Due to this being a dietary or behavioural factor over anything heritable, success and fecundity of Crystal Beard individuals won't result in more of them. The absence of both Steel and Crystal Beard in the New World could suggest that the Elder's Recess has a different lava and rock composition compared to the Old World volcanic belt, though hunting could also possibly explain Crystal Beard's rarity. It's mentioned that special clearance is needed due to the danger Crystal Beard possesses, not because the guild are especially worried about Uragaan and the consequences of killing such unique individuals. The widely beloved Steel Uragaan are individuals that have undergone some changes due to diet, resulting in both different scale colour and different gas composition too. The sulphurous gases emitted by Steel would suggest that it's been eating, well, sulphur. In our own world, sulphur is super abundant and essential for life, and this may be true in Monster Hunter as well. But Steel may have access to high densities of sulfide or sulfate minerals, like pyrite or gypsum. Uragaan's gas is a result of its diet, and Steel seems unable to create sleep compounds with its diet, but rather instead makes a stinking volatile secretion of sulphurous compounds. This is essentially the same as what skunks make, which is an organosulfate, and is famously bad smelling and hard to get out. Many predatory wyverns that can't fly may rely as much or more on scent than sight, and so an incredible stink may be able to put off even volcanic top predators like a cantor. Alternatively, the lesser success, as well as a different distribution of surface minerals, may be one reason why Steel Uragaan are less common. Certainly not over hunting. The reason for both Uragaan and Gravios' sleep gas is ostensibly an anti-predator mechanism, and why Gravios changes it from poison as a juvenile to sleep as an adult isn't clear. One suggestion could be the tenacity of its main predator, a cantor. Whilst being poisoned is rarely fatal to other large monsters, and especially not to a cantor, it is usually unpleasant enough to break off an attack and dissuade further attempts. Aggression, hunger, or prey preference may mean that a poisoned cantor just won't be sufficiently cowed by the toxins, and would readily eat Gravios anyway. Rather, sleep gas, even if it isn't 100% effective against an acantor, may still be able to drug it into a state of drowsiness and incoordination that a Gravios or Uragaan may be able to make its escape. Uragaan and Radobaan both have another method of escape too, which is their unique locomotion of rolling. Whilst both will use this for basic traversal, it may have its roots in escape, and this is why animals roll. Similar behaviour is seen in caterpillars, spiders, and salamanders, and its root lies in these being mountain or dune animals, that, when accosted by a predator, fling themselves down a cliff where it would be difficult to follow, and more difficult to do so at their speed. It's also possible it could be a major energetic saving for Uragaan and Radobaan too. Very big animals don't like mountains, or even hills, as climbing a slope when you're huge is a lot more expensive. Whilst Monster Hunter's relationship with physics in this regard is tenuous at best, the stamina mechanic is still a thing, and monsters would still preferentially take paths of least resistance. Whilst descending is presumably not as expensive as climbing, big animals that don't like falling would still be constantly arresting their own momentum on a descent to prevent a dangerous fall. So descending may take more effort than base walking for giant animals too. Simply rolling saves a huge amount of time and is next to no physical exertion. And with some volcanic areas seen in both the New and Old World, they seem to have pathways like the columnar basalt in the Elder's Recess, that may provide the perfect runway to roll down and save a lot. Considering the amount of time that would be spent eating both to replenish a climb and in general for both of them, the time saving of getting down the other end of a slope in minutes or seconds could potentially be as important as the energy saving too. This may also be why Uragaan can take a packed lunch with it too, and especially trying or oarless climb may require a feeding stop along the way. For Radobaan it may be easier though. The upper layers of the veil are filled with bones it can readily eat, and said bones are a very rich food source as discussed. So for Radobaan it may be less of a tiring slog to get up elevations, and more of a leisurely lunch walk, with both plenty stops and just grazing as it goes, before a rolling sprint back down for whatever reason. For Uragaan, rolling also has some physical importance too. The spines along its back will grow throughout a Uragaan's life, and are worn down and kept smooth and flat by rolling. A Uragaan kept in captivity in an area too small to roll will likely end up resembling Zenith Uragaan as these grow into unwieldy and possibly uncomfortable spines. The young Uragaan that don't have them yet will practice rolling on flat surfaces, in other words, engage in play behaviour. This actually seems present in adults too. The Uragaan ecology video shows two adults racing and ramming into each other, almost trampling an unfortunate feline. The lack of lustrous ore would suggest this isn't two competing males, and the fact one doesn't flee and just roll away suggests it's also not hugely serious either. So despite their ugly stoic expressions, it seems Uragaan may well have a softer side, and some sense of play and fun. It's not entirely impossible they just flat out enjoy rolling too. Of course, the only downside of this locomotion is being unable to see what's in front of you. Radobaan aren't actually aggressive wyverns, even being described as gentle, and the unfortunate Radobaan that encountered a tigrex in the Vale likely didn't know what was happening until it had been caught, and then couldn't react in time. For the most part, this likely isn't a frequent problem, and whilst Radobaan may fare poorly against Odogaron, and likely acidic Glavenus, neither can likely stop a rolling Radobaan in time. Val probably won't wake up, but the two also likely don't encounter one another, due to Radobaan being a resident to the upper regions of the Vale, and having no adaptations for the lower levels of intense effluvium. Whilst rolling may work well on Great Gyros and its pack, as a species they're pretty weak to the sleep gas Radobaan creates. If cornered by them, Radobaan may well be able to gas them into sleep, and then make its escape. The young may be peaceful too. In a move similar to Basarios, it's mentioned Radobaan are born in the layer of tar, bones and decay their parents adorn themselves with, and so on hatching are already coated in it the second they come out the egg. In the upper reaches of the Vale, this makes for ideal visual and olfactory camouflage, letting them blend in perfectly with the bone-clad floor. Even researchers have difficulty finding them, and as such little is known about the juvenile stages of Radobaan, other than their secretive nature spent hiding sequestered in the ground. Gravios are generally not so gentle, and we see when accosted it opens by blasting things with a lava laser. As a giant killdozer monster that's only really threatened by the Black God, and arguably hunters, it has little need for rolling or retreating for much of its adult life. But things are very different when young, and the juvenile Basarios are famous for their camouflage. Whilst being disturbed by small animals will typically cause Basarios to arise and chase off the intruders, or possibly be an unsuccessful attempt at predation, presumably Basarios stays hidden for larger and more serious threats, and this is the chief reason why it hides partially underground to start with. This works well enough for sight-based predators already. Something like Azure Rathalos or Basiljuice flying overhead would presumably be unable to distinguish a Basarios from any other rock. Bird wyverns seemingly can't, and humans, which are generally pretty sight-oriented, can also mistake Basarios for rocks. First-time hunters often do, and this is the reason miners can often be mauled by Basarios too. As said, many flightless predators may rely on smell as much or more than sight, at least initially when searching for prey. In this regard it may seem that Basarios is cooked, but the success of its camouflage suggests that this may be on multiple levels, and Basarios may exhibit chemical crypsis as well. This is essentially camouflaging your smell, mainly by not having one for predators to detect. Puff adders are the chief vertebrate species studied thus far in doing this, and trained dogs and meerkats that easily find other snake species repeatedly failed to track down puff adders. It suggested the snakes may do this via a very low metabolism, with them essentially producing less metabolically active compounds by just not being very metabolically active themselves. Puff adders move very little in general when they're not searching for mates, and have other behaviours like defecating at the shedding site and before a move too, to leave the odorous feces and skin behind when they go. So Basarios likely spend a lot of time hiding, and when hidden in the ground may share similar traits, being metabolically sluggish for much of the time to increase their concealment, as well as other behaviours like defecating in old holes they leave behind, and minimal sloughing of their own scales. If somehow found though, Basarios may still not make it easy for their predator. Its armour is apparently even tougher when in its subadult form, and considering the strength of Gravios' armour, the rocky carapace across a Basarios' back must be near impenetrable, hence why this is the only part of Basarios exposed when buried. When in volcanic regions, Basarios avoid the open lava flows their parents prefer, and are more often found in the areas of loose shale, talus and pumice around the greater reaches of the volcano, and this may well be a specifically selected area, for both ease of burial for Basarios, but also difficulty in extrication. Such material may be frustrating for a predator to dig through to unearth them, with the loose rock just pouring back in as it's dug out. It would also absorb the blast resulting from Brachidios slime, with the loose, ablative rock shattering to transfer the energy, and thus filling in the gaps further with the now smaller pieces as the digging continued. The position of its wings may also help, and Basarios may wedge its wings into the substrate to add to the functional weight a predator has to remove. Basarios' wings are especially stiff, and so as well as digging it may be another way to better wedge themselves in too. If extricated, then it seems Basarios have no choice but to go on the offensive, ramming the opponent with an armoured body but also using poison gas. This may be sufficient to repel some predators, but for Brachidios we could also fancifully suggest it has some sporicidal properties to deactivate or kill the explosive slime mould and greatly reduce Brachidios' lethality. The unusual assortment of gases Gravios possesses in its assorted stage of life may not just be for anti-predator mechanisms too, but also communication. Intraspecific communication in wyverns is lesser known, as many are chiefly solitary. The long-term pair-bonded wraths show mammalian-like facial tissues to better convey emotion, with muscular lips allowing them to snarl and display hostility, or chuff and display what seems to be stress, among other gestures not yet seen. Gravios has the opposite, and due to the reinforced soft tissues, they can't convey any real facial gestures, and may even struggle to do much with body language too. Whilst their distant relatives seem to use sound and smell to communicate, Gravios' hearing doesn't seem anywhere near as good as a Bloss wyvern's. Diablos at least has poor eyesight due to its habit of burrowing, so the same is possibly true of Monobloss, and considering their early habits of burrowing when young, could also be the case for Gravios too. So it may boil down to just scent and pheromone communication. This may be an early prompt for the gases, as the Gravios ancestor moved into the volcanic regions that made it difficult to use other senses and provided a need to regularly vent heat, so it chiefly relied on scent marks for long term and emitting pheromones in the short term. Whilst the gas vented is often digested waste products, this may not be the only thing vented, and as well as similar mass expulsions for certain reasons, Gravios may essentially always be constantly seeping out some form of scent or pheromone to pass messages to its own kind. Such messages are likely not complex, and only relay basic information like presence and time since present, or mating availability. It's possible the youngsters may be more friendly. And interestingly, some quests describe Basarios as living in groups of several individuals. The reasons for this are hard to say. On one hand, multiple Basarios in one place decrease the risk to each individual Basarios, but on the other it likely increases their odds of detection. It could also be just a simple resource hotspot, and areas with both productive ore deposits or a lot of large invertebrates may draw in multiple Basarios, possibly to their own detriment too. In terms of interspecific relations, Gravios probably isn't any more verbose. Certain ore patches are hotly contested resources in volcanic areas. Uragaan is apparently said to be aggressive due to the amount of food it requires, and glavenous bulls also require certain minerals to grow and show off their tail at its highest quality. As such, at certain times of the year especially, volcanic areas may well just become giant dog piles of belligerent territorial monsters, all contesting one another for the best ore. Whether these contests are relatively evenly matched, or if there are typical dominance, is unknown, although it could be worth noting only one of the three has the title Lord of the Volcano. Humans, despite being small and scarcely edible to a Gravios, are not spared this treatment either, and there are unsurprising records of Gravios having both killed hunters attempting to slay them, but also unfortunate miners in the volcano too, with the mining industry possibly being one of the largest and most important in the Monster Hunter world. Gravios may become dependent on deeper volcanic areas protected by lava modes, as development and demand ramp up in the volcanic belt. An unlikely saviour may be the same royals often demanding their heads, albeit for their juvenile phases. Adornment or secretion of gemstones isn't unique to rare males in Uragaan, but is more commonly seen in the juvenile Gravios. Ostensibly, this occurs due to diet as well, with Basarios excreting crystals such as rubies along its back in the main growth areas for its armour. This is seemingly caused by a significant amount of certain minerals in Basarios' diet, as even non-ruby individuals will actually excrete gemstones naturally too. Basarios tears are a colourful term for small, faint pink gemstones secreted by the tear ducts. Wyvern tears are often an odd collectible item, and it may be an ancestral trait for the family that excess minerals are excreted through the tear ducts. When a great surplus of minerals is consumed, it presumably results in a ruby Basarios. This would suggest that such Basarios feed in areas rich in aluminium, with the addition of chromium to the base corundum creating ruby. It's unknown why only ruby Basarios exist when multiple gemstones can be created by aluminium, but maybe it's to do with the chromium. There's some evidence to suggest it can help synthesize insulin in humans, and so help with metabolism. Maybe it has similar properties in Basarios, and helps them control their own metabolisms better to stay hidden. The faint pink nature of Basarios tears may suggest frequent low-level consumption of chromium too. Areas low in this, or with impurities of iron or titanium instead, could in theory result in a sapphire Basarios too. Rubies are essentially just sapphires with added chromium, but both gemstones are very hard, and so may not reduce Basarios armour despite their glass-like appearance. Another reason for consumption of such minerals could be that they even reinforce Basarios' shell. By contrast, the gemstone emerald is actually very weak, and so would provide poor armour if a Basarios had instead consumed beryl with chromium. Amethyst is a purple form of quartz, providing reasonable protection but not as good as ruby or sapphire. But quartz can be easy to obtain, and so could be a fair choice for nobility who want a purple Basarios. So in theory, multiple different colours of gemstone could be seen in Basarios. For the nobility, who love showing off and keeping wyverns as pets, it could be that multiple Basarios are captured and then fed different minerals, so nobles can boast and host in their own Basarios gardens with all the different colours of gemstone. With their long lifespans and a sedentary, secretive and sluggish nature, that still displays the gemstones without needing too much space or food to do so, gemstone Basarios may be the ideal beast for any preening menagerie lord. What happens after 20 or so years when they metamorphose into giant belligerent cement trucks with lasers attached can be left for their heirs to sort out. Why there aren't any gemstone Gravios is unknown. It could be such minerals just become diluted across the greater volume and surface area of shell, or perhaps get melted off after the newly formed Gravios' first lava bath. Maybe the adults can better digest aluminium, or maybe, like Crystalbeard, they're just too tempting a target to go after. At press time, it'll remain one of the many mysterious traits that still surround this relatively frequently hunted wyvern. Another could be the presence of Basarios in the desert, and the absence of Gravios. This is especially weird, as it's both an unrecorded place for Basarios to show up, and usually Gravios are also seen in the same places their offspring are too. Perhaps the lack of adults is due to sufficient resources. The nutrient-poor soils of the desert could represent a lack of good mineral density in the area, and so there may not just be enough solid food to sustain adult Gravios. If we want to get speculative, we could even suggest that Sandy Plains Basarios are neotenous, like axolotls, reaching sexual maturity and breeding without turning into their adult form. This is believed to be done to better exploit variable resources in their native waterways, and neoteny has evolved independently several times in other salamanders too. This is arguably supported by how Basarios seem to turn into adult Gravios. To look at their respective sizes, it seems that it's not a case of Basarios gradually turning into a Gravios, but more Basarios growing continuously to near full adult size, before a presumably rapid transformation into the formidable Gravios. It's unknown if sexual maturity can occur before the change, but if so, it could support neoteny in a resource-stressed population. If not, it still sheds some light on the ontogeny of Gravios. The rapid change also makes sense based on what we know of them too. That a long transitioning morph may not have the stealth of Basarios nor the strength of Gravios to keep itself safe, and so the wyverns would want to spend as little time in between the two distinct forms as possible, as well as helping partitioning between the adults and the young. Another beguiling mystery is why Uragaan is present in the New World and Gravios isn't. There doesn't seem to be anything holding them back in the recess, and if anything, the presence of the nebulous bioenergy seems to result in better conditioned animals there. So perhaps the reason lies outside the recess. Whereas baby Uragaan are born and raised in volcanic areas too, baby Gravios typically spend the first portion of their lives in wetland areas, or at least the less harsh parts of the volcano. The rotten vale could be an insufficient area for Basarios to mature in, and the recess could lack sufficient substrate for camouflage, so it could be that Gravios typically fail to reproduce if they ever reached the recess. Or it could be that the recess Uragaan aren't Old World Uragaan. Whilst Uragaan can go downhill pretty fast, they're not hugely mobile wyverns, and they probably won't be anyone's first pick as a globetrotter. Even with a handy land bridge, it seems hard to envision Uragaan traversing across an entire continent. So maybe it was rather a common ancestor that did, being one of the widespread wood-eating or at least more generalist brute wyverns, that either crossed the land bridge or were already present on the landmass before it split, if it's a Pangea-like situation. This would mean that Uragaan essentially evolved twice, and Old and New World Uragaan may actually be completely different species, potentially not even the same genus. And this can happen between remarkably similar looking species. The clouded leopard is one such example, with its Sunda counterpart originally believed to be a subspecies that turned out to be a completely different species full stop, despite how similar they look. This could be the same thing with Uragaan, and may also mean that it's more of a case of Radobaan and Uragaan sharing a common ancestor, rather than Radobaan specifically deriving from Uragaan. This in turn may also explain Radobaan's lack of effluvium resistance. As said with Glavenus, Acidic was uniquely poised to take to the Vale due to it already being able to withstand and filter out toxic fumes from the volcano. We'd expect something derived from the similarly volcanic Uragaan to do the same, whereas the sharing of a generalist and not volcano-specialised common ancestor would better explain why Radobaan wasn't able to recycle Uragaan's adaptations. So despite a long history in the series thus far, despite all we know about the stone giants, it's clear that there's plenty more beguiling mysteries that we'll have to wait for future games to shed more light on. So I have a lot of thoughts on the four of them. Well, not so much Radobaan. I think Radobaan is generally a good advancement of Uragaan's ideas and moveset that led to him being a fairly solid fight, but with some of the less fun things about Uragaan, like the bombs, chopped out. I've said before I think World has a bit of a mid-game slump with its roster, where after Anjanath the middle tiers are competent, if not hugely exciting or interesting. And I'll still take competent and middling over memorably bad any day of the week, but it did feel like they often didn't match up to either the very characterful lower monsters, or the more entertaining higher monsters. On one hand, Radobaan has a lot of his ecology baked into his movement, as he replenishes his bones by moving, but on the other hand there's not much else about him, and he doesn't really do much if you follow him through the Vale, so that's him. But now to Uragaan. I've also said before I'm not a big fan, as I do think he essentially takes Gravios' role but does a worse job of it, with a near-complete ecological and roster role overlap. Even the rolling was originally for Gravios too, interestingly, but became Uragan's, and Gravios got the horizontal over vertical rolling that was an extra move over the core of his fight. But 5th gen did make me more grateful. When I saw the ringer of humiliation Gravios would have been put through if Uragaan didn't exist, so he has his place in things. I don't think his fight is bad, but it's also not amazing, and I can understand why some would be really unhappy with either bombs or fire thrown everywhere or the bounce spam. As on the latter, it's a rare instance of an earlier gen monster getting a more complex mechanic than a later one, with Gravios being a monster you have to forcibly chip down to actually get anywhere in the fight, whereas Uragaan has far less impactful part breaks, although you can argue this impact only really came in 4th gen. I do think there's some quality to Uragaan though, and a lot of it comes from being in Tri, where the small roster all got a lot of attention. He uses the map in his fight pretty well, except for Generations Ultimate of course. And Uragaan has some of the best sound design of any monster, with a lot of bespoke noises. And I do say noises over vocalizations, as so much of it isn't created by his voice box so much as his armoured body. The vibe it thusly gives is fantastic, with Uragaan sounding like a great creaking piece of mining machinery left in the volcano to rust, now just groaning with every step that in turn really sells his size and weight. Combine that with a unique silhouette, the rolling and the chin pounding, and Uragaan just makes for a very distinct monster, like many in Tri. Said silhouette could be every bit as recognisable after a redesign though, and I do think some aspects of Uragaan's design can come across as very ugly and non-functional. The flat human face is just weird, and the shape of the chin also makes it look like he'd struggle actually getting food into his mouth. Much of these are solved by his superior concept art, which I generally think sells Uragaan better as a brute that's turned away from carnivory, and so the placement of its eyes has changed, as well as generally having a more functional looking chin and a more aesthetic looking head. Uragaan's subspecies and deviants are also middling, with Steel Uragaan, despite being quite cool looking, literally having the title of least favourite monster. I do like the idea of ore eaters growing crystal deposits though, but I think in all of them that's really underutilised. There's got to be a cool Gravios deviant somewhere in there. But that brings us neatly to Gaz and Baz. Gravios was one of my less liked monsters back in 1st gen, when it was the only gen, but since then he's really grown on me a lot. I think there's so much to Gravios that comes with him being the great golem wyvern. Just as silence can be deafening, as monsters get more personality and more bespoke animations, Gravios' lack of such just speaks volumes in comparison. A great unfeeling stone giant, so huge and well armoured it essentially doesn't need the emotion of fear, and can only regard the things around it with stony indifference. If Gravios does feel, it can't show it, as its adaptations for its home mean that its rocky exterior conceals weakness as much as any emotion. Even in the PS2 era, Gravios still had some certain source to him. The escalation of power from the weak fireballs to the laser that only Gravios had said a lot that you were facing something that was just a cut above the other monsters. Additions to basic animations also sold his weight too, with the length of the skid after his charge. Similarly, his flinch animation being him shaking himself as if bothered by flies, I always thought inferred so much too. The idea that Gravios is so powerful and well armoured that pain is unfamiliar to it, so it treats it more as an irritation instead. Design-wise, I think Gravios would benefit more than a lot of other monsters from a graphical update, as there's a lot to him that gets lost through the PS2 and Nintendo graphics. He comes across as softer and more bulbous. His face is a lot more goofy. He's sort of a big fat Michelin Man wyvern. In his brief ecology cutscene he looks a lot better, with a harsher and more angular face like an unfeeling stone mask, and details like his small tusks being much more pronounced. But as much as I'd like to see Gravios back, any indication of his return would concern me. I've been pretty critical of favouritism in monsters, both overall and in their interactions, and in that regard I think Gravios would almost certainly be sold short. Gravios really is a monster of true elder proportion and resilience, who Capcom repeatedly disregard as weaker than the dumbass Dragon Ball monkey. It would take a lot of time and care to fully recognise everything Gravios can and should be, through its uniqueness. I think Takuda could, if anyone could, and the realisation of Diablos and its role and ambience within the Wildspire in World was generally all I wanted for it. But if he's not back in Takuda's game, then I don't see an especially bright future for it. If Basil is thrown under the bus to jerk off Magna, then Gravios is definitely getting thrown under the bus to jerk off Brachydios. As the last standing apex of the volcano undefeated by Fujioka's baby blue boy, there's a noticeable target on his head. On to his fight. I have talked about Gravios before, and many disagreed in the comments, and would disagree in general, not really liking the heavy emphasis on part breaks. And my question is, what exactly do you want the alternative to be? Slower sleep Diablos with a laser like in 1st gen? Replay 1 and see how rewarding that is to beat. It's always frustrating to see something done differently and interestingly, only for the fanbase to burst into tears over it, and then complain that another roster is too similar, and can't help but feel a lot of people forget they're playing the difficult boss fight game. I personally consider a good fight as one you can get a good back and forth going with, or one that beats me and makes me reconsider the strategy I used on the last monster, and how to change things up here. Challenge is good because the takedown is more rewarding when it means something, and breaking Gravios' parts and seeing the fight become progressively easier because of it is immensely satisfying. Considering the part break relation to mounting too, I also feel Gravios was one of the most successfully translated 1st gen monsters to 4th gen. I don't know if people were just trying to brute force Gravios with no attempt on multiple part breaks, or if they were just using a bad weapon, but I don't understand how you can't find that disassembly process pleasing. On to Basarios. And Basarios I can more understand as something of a lackluster monster. He's more interesting than he is fun. The idea of him being an immature Gravios I do think is wonderfully creative. It enriches the lore of both monsters, and was one of those early things that showed Monster Hunter was just different, as early as 1. Anyone else would have just had them be different species. Some of his attacks, showing him trying to do Gravios things and failing, are really nice touches. Design-wise, I think he's pretty good, but works best when paired with Gravios, showing him as the fat little nervous lump who's essentially a rocky tadpole, compared to what he grows into. Singly, he's not bad, but he works better with the knowledge of his babyhood. The moss growing on him in 4th gen is also nice to show how long Basarios can spend stationary and hidden too. Fight-wise, he's still a very bouncy fight, but with none of the reward of meaningful part breaks, and is also just a generally less intense and slower fight too. I do think a lot of the complaints I see or received about Gravios can apply to Basarios, but at the same time I would describe him as more mid over bad. Basarios isn't obnoxious to deal with, just a bit boring. In fact, he's pretty easy. In 4th gen, I don't mind him at all, compared to the chore of 1st and 2nd gen. The extra moves, like his rolling and the rubies, I think spruce up the fight decently. But come Rise, he's essentially pointless, in that I think the heat-up mechanic just completely removes the point of Basarios as a monster. Basarios' fight comes from his armor, and overcoming it. Removing that, and you barely have the concept of a distinct fight. It's also asinine lore-wise that something that is so dependent on its armor becomes soft and useless when exposed to heat, when it lives in a volcano, can heat itself up, and regularly encounters fire element monsters. The stolen Yukon-Lost land swimming I'm also not entirely sold on either, but in that area I do think Basarios has some potential. I've said before, for some mid-ranked monsters, where a lot of their essence comes from their surroundings, that you could ditch the idea of subspecies, and have regional variants for different maps instead. For Basarios, base can be in the outer layers of the volcano, ruby in swampier environments where there's clearly crystallization of the minerals, and then we can actually take a note from online and fully implement Sandstone Basarios as the land swimming one, if he has to stay in desert areas. You could even encourage hunting him with the incentive of getting different weapon and armor styles too. You fought him in literally one area he couldn't leave with no limping or anything, just you and Baz until Baz died. It was a weird quest, and when you wound up doing a lot in one, because Basarios' poison and the unlimiting respawning Vespoids made it the best way to get their parts for Vespoid gear, and monster fluid too. But overall, despite my initial misgivings towards them, I have become pretty fond of both Basarios and Gravios as a duo, the latter especially. Thanks for watching, and as ever, a huge thanks to my patrons: Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Dapperaptor, Bonecrusher Hyena, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, whose generosity helps keep this channel going. There's a link in the description for any interested in signing up, and any amount is always appreciated, and you can vote on future videos too. Thanks as ever to Kamen Rider Moten for providing the digital artwork for this video too. A link to their assorted social media is provided in the description, and they're open for commissions too if you'd like your own made. Thanks to Dragon Master for also providing the piece of Basarios hunting the Senator, who is keen to show off some of his own work too. Thanks to I Am the Kaiju King for the skulls of the assorted wyverns for this video. For more skulls, more original artwork, and his own theories, a link is provided in the description for his Tumblr, so you can check out more. And thanks to Goji for providing information from the older untranslated texts, and their size comparisons for the rock wyverns too. This was a long video, far longer than what I anticipated when starting to write it. In fact, it really should have been 2 separate episodes, and considering the terrible recording conditions that you can probably hear throughout this video, it was quite a slog to make. I can only apologise for that. And I suppose that's what I get for putting off these particular wyverns and general volcano dwellers for so long. Although, by doing Gravios and Basarios, I've now done all the first gen non-elder large monsters, or the cast of the offline game, which is something. However, none of them are especially popular. Steel Uragaan is the least popular monster, and Ruby Basarios is the least popular flying wyvern. None of them crest the top 100 either. After the similarly disliked Nawa and Ibushi, I suppose I should try to drum up the numbers with a fan favourite. So for the next video,